Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I love this. It's recording in progress. Should I leave the meeting? These are the questions.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Show of hands. Who actually got to watch these episodes?
I did.
Last week I did. We couldn't do it this week. We couldn't find it free.
Yeah. I don't know what to do about that. But so let's I guess we're going to talk a little bit about Star Trek Voyager today. Star Trek Voyager is actually not, we're doing this a little out of order because generally we did TOS, then we did TNG, now we're doing Voyager. But if we were doing it in airing order, we would do Deep Space Nine next. But I'm really looking forward to ending with Deep Space Nine, so we're doing Voyager now. What's really important about Voyager is really that Voyager, the ship, is not currently in Federation space. Rather, the ship has launched 70,000 light years away and deposited in the Delta Quadrant, meaning that Voyager is about 70 years worth of travel away from any other manifestation of Federation culture. How they get there, not super important, but is dumb, just for the record. Even more complicated is the fact that the crew is comprised of both Starfleet officers and members of a resistance group called the Maquis. That group formed in response to the approval of a treaty between the Federation and a species known as the Cardassians that ceded a number of Federation colonies to the Cardassians. The Maquis formed from colonists, Starfleet dissidents, and others who consider the treaty to be a betrayal by the Federation of its own ideals and them. They turned to terrorism, and most of the time, Starfleet gets sent to stop them. There is, as you no doubt noticed, if you got a chance to watch the episodes, some underlying tension between the two groups. However, the Maquis agree to merge with Voyager Starfleet crew because doing so represents everyone's best chance at making the 7-decade-long journey home. Tuvok, the Vulcan, has always been a member of Starfleet, but he did go undercover with the same Maquis cell that gets absorbed into Voyager's crew and was captained by Chakotay, placing him, by this I mean Tuvok, in a somewhat particular position. Lon Suder, as you no doubt gleaned, is a former member of that Maquis cell, though he has no dog in that particular hunt. Seska, who appears in Basics, is a Cardassian spy who was embedded in that same Maquis cell and has now allied herself with the Kazon, who are a warrior race indigenous to the Delta Quadrant that Janeway has alienated as she refused to share certain Federation technologies with them, mostly the replicator. That's the global context that gives rise to the events in both Meld and the Basics two-parter. And while there's a lot to discuss in these 3 episodes that I mentioned last week, I'd like to explore Lon Suder as a character and his relationship with Tuvok. Suder is an excellent example of what it is to be other. First, he's not the typical choice for a member of the Maquis, right? He comes from Beta Z, a Federation world with absolutely no ties to the conflict with the Cardassians. And Suder apparently never spent a tremendous amount of time under Cardassian occupation. Rather, he joins as a way to find an outlet for his own dark impulses and frequently frightens his fellow Maquis. The Maquis, therefore, provided him with the opportunity to commit the violence he so desperately craved. And judging from Chakotay's concerns, Suder took full advantage of that opportunity. Secondly, Suder's not human. He's Betazoid, which is an important distinction because Betazoids are telepaths. That's in part why melding with Suder affects Tuvok so strongly. But more importantly, it's why his impulses are so hard to control. That said, Meld makes it very, very clear that Suder understands what he's doing as he's doing it. Think about that for a moment. Suder is fully aware that these impulses, especially when he acts on them, aren't healthy or normal. He knows he's causing irreparable harm, but he just can't stop himself. There's a kind of horror there that I think is difficult to appreciate. In a way, now, mind you, I'm not saying our sins are at the level of murder, clearly, or at least I'm assuming that none of y'all have killed anybody recently. Suder's narrative is very similar to our own narrative with sin. Mark 7 reminds us that our nature is inherently sinful. Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats? And he said, that which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lascivious, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All of these things come from within and defile the man. In essence, sin isn't something that we absorb from around us. It's not like a virus or a sunburn. It's something that bubbles up from within us, much like Suder's violent impulses. There's an inevitability there too. Remember, Suder does his best to find therapies that could help him cope with his dark nature. Nothing works until he begins working with Tuvok. And I really, really love this aspect of Suder's character arc. The only thing throughout his recitation that Suder hasn't tried really is reaching out and forming a connection with someone else. It's really this exchange that jumpstarts Suder's road to recovery. Yes, that entails Tuvok sharing some of his Vulcan discipline with Suder via a mind meld, which is Vulcan magic, just go with it. But I think it's the connection with another member of the community that Suder really needed in order to exert some mastery over himself. We also need community and support from each other. That's what we're doing here, right? With this look at Star Trek, I'd argue. And I'd argue that we need these communal moments of discussion, not only to explore what our pop culture says about who we are and what our values might be, but to create that connection. Suder doesn't get better until Tuvok reaches out to him. And looking ahead to the Basics two-parter, it's Tuvok's work with him on orchid breeding, which, y'all, okay, let me tell you something, as someone who tries to grow orchids in a desert, that's no mean feat, all right? They are cranky plants. But it's his work with orchid breeding as a function of general rehabilitation that spurs Suder to not only risk his own life to save Voyager, but that same hard-won control. The Doctor, who's a hologram, only manages to overcome Suder's objections by appealing to that same connection. It's the bond that Tuvok has helped Suder build that ultimately propels him toward retaking Voyager, right? Remember, he's terrified of what's going to happen if he gives in to these violent impulses and acts on them when he's combating the Kazon that have taken over Voyager, right? And it's just Suder and the Doctor, and there's no other choice. So what the Doctor says is, look, there are times when you serve your crew's best interests by being violent. It's not great, it's not ideal, but it's what's important and what's going to do the best for your community right now. So we know that Tuvok has secured Suder's buy-in, by the way, to this at the beginning of Basics, when Suder voluntarily offers to help with the hydroponics processes. We even knew back in Meld, when Suder calls for help for Tuvok rather than killing him, that Tuvok was right. There's something redeemable about Suder. Let's step back and discuss Tuvok for a minute. You could make an argument that Tuvok represents a break from the wisdom we saw in Mark 7. On the face of it, Tuvok only turns violent himself after experiencing Suder's impulses. But I really don't think that's exactly it. Vulcans are a people of deep emotion who turned to logic and emotional repression to avoid self-annihilation. Rather, what's happening in this episode is that the meld weakens Tuvok's own controls, allowing those emotions and impulses to rise to the surface. Thematically, I believe we should take away from the episode that Suder's dark impulses are not confined to him alone. They inhabit each of us. Tuvok, too, requires a reaffirmation of his place in the overall community of the ship in order to regain his internal balance. And I think quite beautifully, that reaffirmation comes from Suder, of all people. He offers Tuvok the wisdom and perspective he's gained from his own struggles. He tells Tuvok that he must control the violence, or that violence will control him, separating him from civilized life. I really love the language he uses here, too. Understand one thing, Tuvok. I can promise you this will not silence your demons. If you can't control the violence controls you. Be prepared to yield your entire being to it, to sacrifice your place in civilized life, for you will no longer be a part of it, and there's no return. This is what he says at the moment that Tuvok has burst in to his quarters with the full intent on executing Suder for his crime of murdering one of the other crewmen. Suder's willing to accept it entirely, but he stops Tuvok. And he reminds Tuvok that he needs to value that connection. There's a sub-theme here also that we have a choice. We can give in to our baser nature, those aspects of ourselves that defile us, but that then removes us from the community, both of man and God. The wages of sin is death, right? I prefer, really, though, to think of it the way that Dante conceptualizes it in the Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, he depicts hell as a sort of funnel, right? Pointed downward, with the wider upper rings representing lesser sins that progress down to Cocytus, the frozen wasteland in which Satan is incarcerated. In fact, I think he actually ends up snacking on Judas for eternity, which is a thing that happens. Well chosen, Dante, well chosen. Anyway, the point I'm making here is that in medieval theology, sin was more a separation from God. It was a misdirection. The more serious your sin, the more misdirected you are, and therefore the farther from God you were. Heaven, by contrast, while still hierarchical, because medieval Catholicism is a much more communal experience, precisely because there are people whose actions or misdirected love did not separate them from either God or the Christian community. The language Suder uses here reflects a similar understanding and a similar metaphor, but Suder ends up being incorrect about the duration of that separation from society. Despite his physical separation from the rest of Voyager's crew, because he does end up confined to quarters, potentially for life, Suder remains emotionally connected to Voyager. Otherwise, why would he think about finding better ways to contribute rather than simply growing orchids while he's in his quarters? While he never quite manages to re-enter Voyager's crew per se, even in basics, he mostly works with the Doctor. He maintains that same emotional connection to his community. However, maintaining that sense of community requires making a choice, just as much as choosing to surrender to our darker nature. If both the Federation and heaven require us to make reciprocal promises to our communities, as we discussed last week, Suder serves as a reminder that one of the reciprocal obligations we have is to reach out when help is necessary, and to then accept the help that is offered. Sit with that for a second. How many times have we failed to recognize offers of help or rejected offers of help because they did not take the form we expected? I know that I certainly have rejected offers that I misunderstood, much to my later regret. And I'm sure that my mama, who's sitting right there, can provide all the details if you are interested. Suder and Tuvok do negotiate the form that aid will take, establishing valid boundaries between them, like no more mind meld again. But Suder is open to and accepts Tuvok's help in, if not returning to the community precisely, but in finding better balance in himself. Suder recognizes his need to reach outside of himself for that aid, just as he knows that he must accept it. We're looking into Holy Week now, which climaxes in Good Friday, the Crucifixion. The story we tell here is that God in man made manifest sacrifices himself to offer us help. It's therefore our responsibility to accept that help. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, as John tells us. God makes good on that offer of salvation, but we have to accept it. Suder doesn't believe himself worthy of salvation, nor does he believe same will be offered to him. However, Tuvok does make that offer. Significantly, though, Suder's acceptance of Tuvok's aid and community does not wipe away the stain of his actions either. His service does not expunge that sin, and we never quite get a chance to see how Janeway, the captain, would address that lack of expiation with Suder. I'd argue, however, that we do get a chance to see how the Federation deals with it in the character of Tom Paris. I didn't mention Paris previously because he's not really central to the Suder narrative, but I do want to point out here that before the events of these episodes and before the events of that cast Voyager into the Delta Quadrant, Janeway pulls Tom Paris out of a penal colony to become her pilot. She doesn't ignore the crimes he committed that resulted in his imprisonment, but she does offer him a chance to do better. Paris rises to the occasion and becomes an integral part of Voyager's crew. God's grant of salvation is far broader than Starfleet's, but I think how Star Trek treats those whose actions have made themselves the other, whose actions caused them to be removed from the community, reminds us of what it is to forgive. We pray that God forgives us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lent is a season of reflection, and we're meant to reflect not only on our own sins and imperfections, but I'd also argue that we should take the time to reflect on how we respond to sins committed against us. Are we going to be like the Federation and the father of the prodigal son? Are we going to celebrate that one son who was dead and is now alive? Or are we going to be the elder son in the parable and continue to reject our brother who has been wronged and has wronged us, but now returns? Suder's narrative is ultimately one of atonement and redemption. He sacrifices himself for the needs of the many because Tuvok has helped him embrace his ties to that community. We also have to embrace our ties to our community and our obligations to them, even where they're the least of these or someone who has wronged us. That's a tall order, I know, and one with which I spend a great deal of time wrestling, especially right now. However, God promises us salvation, but not that getting there is going to be easy. We're going to explore a bit of that next week when we watch It's Only a Paper Moon from Deep Space Nine. In that story, the character of Nog has to recover from a truly terrible experience, and he comes to perceive that horror as being manifested in his physical self. We'll watch Nog struggle with this, and he'll come to an unusual solution. However, what Paper Moon also reminds us is that even when we ourselves become the other for reasons beyond our control, we must make the difficult choice to come back. It's a beautiful story, and it's one of my favorite Deep Space Nine episodes of all time. Nog must bring himself back, just as we must do the work to better ourselves, and that's perhaps one of the most valuable lessons I think we can learn. And that's all I've got as far as lecture goes this week. Fun fact, though, the gentleman who plays Lon Suder literally left the set of Chucky, where he played the titular Chucky,
I didn't know
to come
that.
play Lon Suder. I did not know that either. I just knew that Brad Dourif was a tremendously talented actor and truly creepy. And then a friend of mine was like, "You know that's Chucky, right?" And I'm like, I mean, I get that he's the Chucky of Voyager. And he's like, no. I mean that literally. Like, he was Chucky. I'm like, you know, the creepy doll. Yep.
My favorite character in this.
I'm sorry, Marcia, I missed that.
Oh, I said he was my favorite character in this.
Fun.
And I didn't look like Chucky.
Like I said, Brad Dourif is really fantastic, and they put a tremendous amount of weight on him, because I don't think if if he hadn't made Suder as compelling, I don't think basics would have worked.
Mhm.
Mm.
I really don't. Because about, so half that two-parter focuses on the crew that's been marooned on a random planet and, the hijinks they get up to. And the other half is really just a bottle show. And it's Brad Dourif and Robert Picardo fighting Kazons. And if either of those individuals had not been as strong an actor as they are, it would have been a very different experience.
Mhm.
So yeah, where do we go from here?
This is a really good metaphor, this show, for who is outside of the grace of God. Is anyone outside of the grace of God? And it's not just do they think they are, but does their community, their world think they are? So Lon believed he was unworthy and that what he needed was not going to happen for him. But the truth
he's
is,
incurable, specifically, that he is permanently broken, which I think is the hardest part of it, because he couldn't find a way out of it. Right.
He couldn't by himself, and that's the whole point, is that there is no way out of it by yourself ever. That's why the body of Christ is a body. It's a community reflecting the nature of God too. But more than that is, even like you mentioned, the prodigal son story, which is the gospel for this Sunday.
Go me.
Yes, the Holy Spirit through Marie.
I really feel like the Holy Spirit has better things to do, but like, coincidence is great.
I don't.
God works in mysterious ways.
There you go.
But like the prodigal son, once someone does turn around and come back, then they face resistance from the community that has judged them, like the older brother, and resentment and even retaliation. And so what does a person who have to look forward to when they come to themselves, when they realize maybe I am worthy, maybe I am redeemable, or at least I need to go back where I knew love existed, where I knew relationship existed. The relationship between Tuvok and Lon was the redeeming quality of that whole show.
Yeah,
Tuvok didn't let him go.
Just didn't let him go.
No. And that's what we, as bearers of the Spirit of Christ, that's what we do. We are not the Father who welcomes the Son back. We are not the Federation who has a system. We are not God. We're none of those things, but we are Tuvok, who establishes a relationship with the one who is unworthy, and then holds to it, won't let go.
Right. And that's a pretty tough call when you think about it. I mean, Tuvok's the head of security. This is kind of antithetical to what he does. And Lon Suder's guilty of murder. Right. Murder in the only, it literally, he's just like, yeah, no, I killed this dude for no reason. And Tuvok refuses to accept this. And it's just like, no, you got to have a better reason than that. And so Suder's just like, he looked at me funny, maybe. So I think it's a big struggle for us then, right? Like, I mean, I cannot express how amazing it is that Tuvok, I mean, obviously he's a fake character, but we'll go with this. That Tuvok still manages to reach out.
And I agree with your assessment that Tuvok doing the mind meld isn't why his own impulses rose. It was the breakdown of his own defenses against those. But think about that in relationships between people. So let's pretend they were just humans. There's this criminal, really either psychopathic or sociopathic, doesn't care, just killed somebody. And then there's this other person who is drawn into relationship, feels a need to establish relationship. Which of those two, there's going to be an exchange. Suder, whether he's a person or whatever he is going to gain from Tuvok. Tuvok is going to gain from Suder. What Suder gains is positive, redemptive. What Tuvok gains is potentially destructive. So in that relationship, there is exchange of life. And the same thing with us as humans. There is exchange of life. That's why it matters that we do it.
That's also what's so great about their negotiation, right? Like, I mean, because they eventually, Suder's all gung-ho about it, right? Because all of the things he's gotten from Tuvok are positive. Tuvok, on the other hand, is not. And I think there's a really good lesson there too, that, you know, we have to set healthy boundaries and we have to respect our own safety, be that mental, be that physical, whatever, before we can make that reach.
We also have to recognize that we are subject to temptations. And when we draw that close to the kinds of temptations that can connect us, reconnect us to our own dark side, as Tuvok did, we have to reestablish our own boundaries too. You know, it's like put the mask on yourself before you put it on your kid.
Right.
Tuvok didn't realize that touching those emotions was going to stir within himself. Maybe he did realize, and he did anyway. That would be an interesting thing. The same thing happens to us. I mean, look at our TV. Everyone's temptation is to have more money, to have more things, to have more, you know, that separation of self, put walls up around my city, put walls up around my house, and to live into the cultural values. Those are our temptations. And they're as immoral as Suder's behavior.
And
they're isolated.
they're self-destructive, and societal destruction occurs as a consequence.
Yes. Yep. Isolation always leads to death. We're made to be in community.
That's actually one of the ways that we de-radicalize people. You actually bring these radicals and get them to interact with people from the group that they're fighting, and on both sides. And they start to realize that they have more in common than they do not. Right. And this is how we break programming. Deprogramming cults a little bit differently, but works a little differently. But this is how we break that, de-radicalize people. And it's a long, painful process. We've really started watching this and stumbled upon this as a solution after the Troubles. Because it really was a situation where there was a whole discussion about how do we reintegrate these people to peace? How does that work?
How do we reintegrate these people
into peace?
Yes. Yeah.
And so the answer,
I think that's also a lesson. I think that's also a lesson that came out of COVID, was the need for community. And
it reminded us.
Yes, we meet on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever you please, but there's something about getting a hug from someone if you live in isolation that really restores, or is a restorative part of the restorative process. And I think COVID really brought that to the forefront, I think, for anybody who was locked up in a house, and most of us were.
Yeah. And I think that was one thing you touched on, was isolation leads to death. And I think it also led to a lot of people acting out in behaviors that would not have happened before. And I think one of the things that we saw, the people having meltdowns in stores or something, and, on airplanes, and, scary things, but and maybe crime as well. But I think it's really caused a change in people. It's going to be hard to reintegrate, and hopefully we can, and it will work. But
hopefully it'll be different once we do.
Hopefully, yes.
I mean, fingers crossed that we'll have a greater appreciation for the opportunity to be together. But I mean, I gotta tell you, even now I walk out and I go to the grocery store and I see somebody without a mask and I'm automatically uncomfortable. I'm like, I'm gonna cross the aisle now. Cheers, mate.
Well, we're not clear yet, so that makes sense. And you have babies to protect, and so it makes a lot of sense. You're only saying I'm out of here. I'm usually saying, what a jerk. Where's your mask?
Right?
How selfish of you. Where's your mask?
Right. And that's been one of the really interesting parts about this whole shebang, right? It's that, COVID as an experience was just so divisive and so politicized between folks who, thought it was nonsense and folks who did not. That it itself, like that divide exacerbated the divisions and the separation and the isolation we were already experiencing, right? I mean, because there was emotional investment in whether or not you were a mask wearer or got vaccinated or got your kids vaccinated or not.
Still is.
Yeah, no, and I'm not gonna lie. I am here to tell you. If you're not gonna go get your shot, we're not having a conversation. Right, but and I have to wrestle with that, and I've got to square that. Because there are a number of folks in my circle that are science averse, is what I'm going to call them.
That's a good word.
Science averse, and kind of watching that has been just this weird experience. And so like now the question is how do I reach across the aisle? How do I reach out and bring these people back into my community when they have acted contrary to the greater interests of the community, including my 3.5-year-old twins.
Yeah. So there's go ahead, Susanna.
I think Susanna has been trying to talk for ages. Like, really, you just got to leap in because I love the sound of my own voice.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I didn't get to watch the episodes for today. We had a very long day with the retreat, and I thought probably after the retreat, after 4:00, I could just get to watch, but then I just slept. The fact I'm saying this is last week when we had this meeting, it was so productive because I watched the video. I was able to understand like some of the characters and some of the themes you were so beautifully bringing out. But now I hear you tell a little bit about atonement. So I'm just curious, like as to how you're connecting atonement to the characters you mentioned here, so that I can relate, because even after this class, I would go and read. So I'm like that kind of person. So if you can explain a little bit on the atonement, how you understand from these characters, so I can just relate it.
So Suder's arc, right? Like, and that's the guy I'm focused on because, like I said, there's a lot in 3 episodes of Star Trek. Believe me, I can squeeze all kinds of stuff out of this. But so just narrowing it down to Suder. In Meld, Suder commits murder for no apparent reason. Just that this is who he is, and that's really important to the story and to the thematic discussion that episode's trying to have. He is found guilty, obviously. Confessions will do that. And Tuvok begins, and he gets basically sentenced to isolation. Like, he has to live in his quarters. He's not allowed to leave. His meals and things are brought to him, blah, blah, blah. But Tuvok keeps coming in and working with him. And we fast forward several months to Basics 1. And in that episode, one of the first interactions we see between Tuvok and Suder is Suder asking Tuvok for the opportunity, because he's gotten really good at breeding orchids. And again, mad props, guys. Mad props for that. I have killed enough orchids to appreciate that. But he wants to use that skill and the skills that he's developed to work in the hydroponics lab. And it's because, and it's not necessarily because he wants to interact with other people. Suder has a really good grasp of understanding why he's not allowed and what he's not allowed to do. But it's because he wants to contribute and he wants to do something for the crew, this community that Tuvok is working on him to accept. And then we move into further into basics, and at the end of that episode, the Kazon, these warrior, they're basically Klingons from Wish, frankly.
That's good.
Yeah, they're Klingons from Wish. They're not good. Anyway, so like they take over the ship and they maroon out the rest of the crew, everybody on this other planet, and they warp away with Voyager. But they all thought Suder was dead because of the way his wall exploded. But he survives unscathed, and it's all good. And in Basics 2 is the story of how Lon Suder and the Doctor retake Voyager. And there's a conversation where Suder tells the Doctor, I've worked too hard, right? I've worked too hard to suppress this part. And I'm afraid that if I engage in the violence you're asking me in which to engage in, that I'm going to undo all of that progress. And it's not until the Doctor looks at Suder and says, sometimes this is the best thing you can do for your crew. And that's the argument that triggers Suder, right? Like that's when he gets the idea. It reminds him of this community. And then what he does is he goes and retakes the ship. Without Suder, without the Doctor, they would never have been able to retake the ship and go back and rescue their fellows. In the process, unfortunately, one of the Kazon warriors kills Suder. So he does actually sacrifice his life as part of this. And, he was also very clearly aware that was a potentiality.
Can I say something about that? Because you mentioned earlier, but I'm not so sure Susanna would have heard it. The Doctor that she's talking about is a hologram. He's not a person. He's an image. And so when Suder goes on this quest to take the ship back, he knows he's the only one who can die there. The Doctor can't die. And he knows that he's one against the entire warrior race that's on the ship. So he knows he's likely to die.
And he still does it, right? I mean, he could have taken, if he prioritized himself, he could have taken a shuttle and tried to escape. He could have tried to negotiate and ingratiate himself with the Kazon, basically be like, look, that awful, terrible person Janeway imprisoned me here for life. And, I'm just like you guys. I likes me the killing. And Seska would have known that, right? Like Seska, who was the Cardassian spy, who was helping the Kazon to take over Voyager. Seska knows that. Seska knows who Suder is, because she worked with Suder as part of the Maquis cell that they were both part of. So he had options, and he turns them down. He turns them down and makes the decision he does to help his crew, to help this community. And I think that's a 180 from where he was as far as a sociopath, because he's actually recognizing the needs of somebody else.
Well, he's recognizing his need to be part of the community in some way, shape, or form.
I think that's true. But I also think it's important, especially when you're talking about a sociopath, to acknowledge that, this is a huge step, guys. Like, we know he has struggled to see people as people, or, other than, like places that he can bury socket wrenches and create bodies. Like, it's
interesting. I just thought of that scripture where Jesus says there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And you always expect the hero to do that. And this time it was the anti-hero. So others
the Doctor is
transformed.
like, the Doctor at one point makes the observation that, all they've got is a hologram and a sociopath, but they're going to have to make do.
Mhm.
It's a fantastic line. And Robert Picardo's comedic timing is just amazing.
He's awesome.
Just amazing. If you haven't got a chance to watch it, I really, really recommend you do, because it's
Well,
it's a
here's what I
great
think I'm
episode
going
for
to do,
Robert Picardo.
Marie. I'm going to have parish-wide viewing. We're about ready to have in-person contact
Mhm.
for us, besides church. And we can watch the episodes and then use your videos as our discussion to follow it. So I think we'll do this again in person. We might invite you in by Zoom, but don't feel like you have to, because we're recording these. And I think these are just so valuable. It's such a wonderful way to approach the Lenten themes.
It's certainly been helpful for me. I will say that it has certainly been a great way to kind of meditate on things that I should be thinking about. And I'm going to miss it when it's over.
Well, we have Zoom. It's never over.
That's
So
valid.
Susanna, did that connect the atonement question that you had?
Yeah. But I like the point you said about how we expect always the heroes to die, but then the anti-hero dies here, and atonement for many rather than seeing it as atonement just for themselves.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
The
I
army
hadn't
at-
actually thought of that before with this.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great arc. Like I said, the Kazon are Klingons from Wish, and I'm not wild about them. Just not. But I love what they do with this character, and I love what Brad Dourif does. And again, like that, if he had not been as talented an actor as he is, I just don't think this would have been as impactful.
Yeah. Or believable.
Right.
Mhm.
The same way I think any other of the TNG cast would not have been able to carry the episode for last week the way Brent Spiner did.
That was amazing.
Fantastic tights, man. Fantastic tights. There was a decided dearth of fantastic tights in this episode. There was a lot of Mod Podge, as far as I can tell, in the costumes. Because this is what, 1994 maybe.
Wow. Yeah.
Because this is still early in Voyager's run. I want to say it's season 2 or season 3.
It's season 2. Yeah. I did find that.
So it's still pretty early. Like, and we still have the world's worst character on Voyager, and that's Cass.
Yes. Oh,
Oh, they never did know what to do with her.
they didn't. Yeah, I have to agree. That was awful.
Yeah,
what they
it
did
was.
do.
It was
awful.
yeah, there was so much bad about that. But like but we still have, I mean, even though Voyager is kind of infamous for being uneven, we still have these gems, these nuggets in it that keep me coming back. And the Lon Suder arc is one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other one is a later season, like in one of the later seasons. It's another Robert Picardo Doctor episode, and we're doing a podcast on it tonight. It's Living Witness.
When he was the only one left.
Yep, when he was the only one left,
yeah.
and he had to figure out where he was and where that made him, or that placed him in this species history. And that's another good conversation about like what is atonement, what is justice, what is is justice actually just, and how do we look at history? How does history phrase the conversation? Again,
it's true. Who defines the justice? Yeah.
Just these really great nuggets.
I want to go back to a point you made earlier about being in relationship and learning through that relationship to incorporate what had been other. Bishop Neil Alexander, retired Bishop of Atlanta, and also he's retired from being dean of my seminary. Well, our seminary, Swanee.
Mhm.
He wrote a
This was
book.
in the college. You know,
You were at
I
the
didn't-
university, yes. He wrote a book years ago. I think I read it in 2004, called "This Far by Grace," and that was when we were in the very white hot part of our church arguments over ordaining and consecrating gays to
right,
the
the Bishop
priesthood.
Robinson issue.
Right, because that was 2003. So the
Right.
book came out as a response to that. And Neil Alexander had been, I think he was a Baptist before he was Episcopalian. And so, but he's a man of his age, and he came into the whole discussion believing what he had been taught all those years about it. And it was his conversion. The book is about his conversion of thinking and acting as a bishop. His conversion happened by being in relationship and recognizing that the love that bound them was the same love that bound him with anybody else, and there was no way to other them anymore. He could not push them back into that category that he had been given all those years, because the love that they shared transformed that. And so the love of Christ was the key. But it wouldn't have, he said it had nothing to do with what anybody was saying about the arguments for and against. None of that mattered. What mattered was his relationship with the people, and his inability to separate that love from any other kind of love he had in personal relationship.
I am a part of all that I have met.
I have met.
Mhm.
I mean, Tennyson gets at it too. Like,
No joke.
I think the best part of these stories that we tell each other is their commonalities. And it's, we're telling the same story, coming at it from different angles and learning new things. And I think that's fantastic.
And I think that's what Jesus was foretelling when he said, I have so much more to tell you, but you cannot bear it now. So basically, hang in there. Stay
It gets
with it.
better,
It's
man.
coming.
It gets better. Just get through season 1. Get through season 1.
Well, and see the different perspectives, because we do have, and Lord knows I'm doing Faulkner tomorrow, and he does that in Sound and I know I hate Faulkner with an unholy passion, but
Though As I Lay Dying is still the funniest book I've ever read.
this is true, but only after you've read the whole thing.
Right.
but in The Sound and the Fury, he does that. You have to put the perspectives together to be able to discern the event that actually occurred, and to figure out why the relationships in that family are the way they are as a consequence of that one event that occurs. And I think we have many of those situations that occur in our lives, and we're not even aware of it,
Right?
Because we're so mired in the situation. We can't get a perspective, and that's what happens. I think to a certain extent in that episode is there's a perspective that is presented to Suder that is one that he had not ever thought would happen. And the same way with Tuvok, he had the perspective there came about, and so they were able to put those two together.
Susanna actually preached something like that last Sunday, when she was obviously is from India, and was talking about karma and the American, almost it seems like an intentional misinterpretation, misuse of the term and the concept, and getting perspective after the generations of regeneration in life. She did a good job with that. And it's helpful to hear from a person from that tradition what karma actually means, not what we've made it into.
Right.
True.
Right. It's not a chameleon. Not a chameleon, guys.
No.
Sorry, Boy George. But I also really like the idea that help can come from strange sources, right?
Yes.
That we have to be open to it, and we have to be able to recognize it when it comes.
Accepting help is difficult.
Is difficult. There's a great story.
Why? But why is that difficult? That's where the sin happens.
Yeah.
Why is accepting help difficult.
Oh, it's
Because
one of the big
number
ones.
one, we don't want to admit that we need help.
It's pride.
Pride.
It's pride. It's pride.
It's also
But-
hubris. I don't need
unmitigated.
God's help. I don't
Yeah.
need your help. I'm completely sufficient on my own.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I also think it's a question of safety. Because to accept help, you have to make yourself vulnerable.
Yes.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
making yourself vulnerable is incredibly hard because that means that you've gifted someone else the capability of hurting you. And so I think there's a fear to sometimes to accepting help and to, and that, so yes, there's pride. There's pride in not admitting that we need it. But there's also this, this fear, right? We're trying, I mean, we're risk averse as a species, really, with some notable exceptions. And we don't want to be hurt, and we don't want to put ourselves out there. And unfortunately, that's part of the process.
Unless you
Well, it
lose your
interferes
life,
in our
you won't save it.
self-image.
Yeah.
It really does interfere in our self-image
Mhm.
that when we admit that we need help.
And Jesus said, if you want to save your life, you have to lose it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You've got to open yourself up. You've got to experience that. You've got to offer of yourself. That's one of your, the reciprocal obligations that we've been talking about now for 2 weeks, and we'll continue talking about next week.
Well, we talk about it every Sunday, so have at it.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, it's a pretty solid theme.
And there's a lot of literature that deals with that theme too.
Yeah,
And it's
some of this is
fascinated
really
man for
interesting.
hundreds of years.
So I've been watching Discovery a lot because Discovery's last episode was last week, and I've been sitting here and listening and thinking about it because the entire season arc is about communication and looking beyond the hurt and trying to understand the person or the species, entity, whatever that has hurt you, and then bringing them back. But also with the understanding that that there is an atonement there that must take place, and how to do that in a diplomatic and healthful fashion. And it's so funny because, I find myself like thinking about that because of Discovery in 2022, which is it was an entire arc that was designed as a response and as a discussion of what we went through during the pandemic.
Wow.
But it's so funny because the same concepts are here, right? Like in 1967, 66, 1991, 94. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter. We're 2,000 years ago.
It's always been.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is take a deep breath and reach out and talk to somebody and, make that connection. It's
More than talk to somebody. This show didn't do that, but I was thinking earlier about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Desmond Tutu,
mhm.
and all of them. And it's more than just talk to somebody, it's talk to the one who hurt you.
Mhm.
Tell them.
Right.
And the one who hurt you has to listen and share with them what
Yeah.
happened. And
There's a
then
concept-
reconciliation can happen.
I don't know that I've mentioned this, but there's a movement in law right now called Restorative Justice. And so
I love it.
The idea is for folks that don't know, is that you have the option of either going through, like you get arrested, you have the option of either going through the regular court system, or you have the option of going through like what ends up being a sort of mediation. And what it is that you have to sit down and interact with the people you hurt, and those people get the opportunity to say, I think you need to do this. I think this needs, X, Y, or Z. Restitution needs to be part of your sentence, if you will. And it ends up being so much more effective. Recidivism rates are minimal comparatively with, regular prison and regular court systems. And it's literally about, it functions because you're recreating community bonds.
Yes.
The Truth and
Stanley
Reconciliation.
Hauerwas wrote that book. He's a theologian, and the book is Restorative Justice. I'll look up the name. Go ahead, Ganan. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that was the focus of what our Lenten discussion was last night at church. Was Bishop Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how we could incorporate that into the painful things or painful events that have occurred in our parish, or mostly in our parish, or because the discussion was really focused on what had hurt us the most in our parish, in the life of our life at Christ Church.
Huh.
Father Francoeur. Oh wait, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Father Francoeur.
His name actually came up at our table.
Oh,
Well, yeah, you're still mad that he didn't want to confirm me.
You were not the only one affected by him. Okay, as it turns out.
but look, he was brought in over his head because the system decided it knew a better way to bring a priest in than the way the church recommended. And it did exactly what happens every time. It hurt everybody.
Well, I have to admit, we were not sorry to see him leave.
I don't think
and I don't usually feel that way.
I don't think.
I think the title of that book by Hauerwas is The Peaceable Kingdom.
And I have heard of that. I think.
Yeah, we studied it in seminary. Restorative Justice and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the difference between a system that's punitive, like in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
He committed a murder. He got sentenced to prison for his life because they were going to be out there forever. It was going to take that long to get anywhere.
Right.
Versus the restorative to both sides of the equation, the victim and the perpetrator, and the community around them. And I'm glad to hear that the statistics are proving it much more effective. I think even back then they were, but
yeah,
I don't know what
the
takes.
Statistics are great.
Gonna take.
Kentucky has a remarkably robust restorative justice program, and there's always an ethics credit that you can do that you sit through a class on it. And when I'm renewing my CLEs, I always make sure to do that one because I think it's such a great concept. And so as a result, it's far less unpleasant to sit through than some of the other ones, say on tax law or bankruptcy or. Yeah. I'm like, all right, give me a feel good story. I'll be over here to channel 2. Thanks.
Well, this has been fabulous once again. I'm just so grateful to you for thinking so wonderfully through these things. And I from now on, you don't have my permission to say I'm no good at this. You're really great at this.
Thank you, Valerie. I've been telling her that her whole life.
She is. I mean, this is.
She doesn't listen. She doesn't listen to her mother.
Oh my God! Here it is.
She must be the only child in the universe. That's true, Val, right?
But it is wonderful. Good thing
Jessica's not here too.
It is also wonderful when they say back to you things you have said.
Yes. So we have one more next week, right?
Yeah,
and I'm really looking forward to that. And I am going to talk to the folks that have asked to see the video about doing another series where we use the videos and sit and watch the series, the episodes together, and then talk about them.
So just to be clear, that'll be good. You're looking for Deep Space Nine. The title of the episode is "It's Only a Paper Moon,"
and that's one episode. Correct?
It's just one.
Yes.
This one was weird. This was weird because I was looking at just basically the evolution of this one character arc. So effectively, it ended up being a little longer.
But it all made sense to do the 3 once you finished the 3. So that was
good. Well, thankfully, although we couldn't see them, I have seen them. So I was operating from a little bit of knowledge, thankfully. Again, thank you tonight for a wonderful conversation. And thank you all for coming and joining us with this. Those that didn't show up tonight will be sorry.
Yes, they will. And we're so glad that I'm so glad that we can do this.
Me too.
I am too. Mhm.
Me too. It's been a long time, Ganan. It's nice to see you.
It is nice to see you. It has been a long time. So
Take care, everybody.
we'll see y'all next
Right.
week.
See you next week.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.